So now, if we look at the hydrologic cycle on the earth, that's the best description, or one of the main descriptions, or parables for understanding how the soul functions, how the spiritual side of the world functions. Also, there's everything there.
Right.
It's one of the mishalim that is most loved in Chassidus because it's so full. And now that we have it even fuller, I mean, we have a much more advanced picture than they did 200 years ago. It becomes even more astounding that really this description of the hydrologic cycle is a framework for understanding everything that's going on. Okay, how does it work?
It's even more than that. It's just another amazing aspect of how Hashem created the world. It is in itself amazing.
Again, it's amazing in and of itself. In and of itself, it's amazing, and it just shows that it's patterns that repeat.
Right.
That you get this grand pattern of the entire Earth and its water cycle, hydrologic cycle, and you get the pattern of one individual or even one nation, and it works the same way. Okay? This is how divine service also works. So we saw this yesterday. Then when Adam was put into Gan Eden, was put into the Garden of Eden, what that symbolizes, what that symbolizes is attaining pleasure. Because Gan Eden is a symbol for pleasure. We said that when we learn Torah and engage in certain other activities where we have no worries and so on, we touch upon this pleasure. We get a chance to eat from this pleasure. But it still requires tending, this Garden of Eden. This pleasure requires tending. You have to water the garden. You have to water the pleasure. How do you do that? I'm skipping a little every time because otherwise we won't finish this mimer this week. So the source of the souls of the entire Jewish people, which is called Knesset Yisrael, the congregation of Israel, it waters the garden. How does it do that? V'inyan. שכשם שבגן צריך להיות בו מעיין להשקותו כדי להצמיח כל פרי שבגן, שהמים מצמיחים כל מיני תענוגים. Just the same way as in a regular orchard or garden, you have to have a wellspring. Right? This is unheard of in Eretz Yisrael, almost. But in Chutz La'aretz, that's exactly how you build a garden. You find a wellspring, because you go into England, you go to Cornwall, go anywhere you want to go.
Thousands of wells.
Everywhere. In Israel, there's hardly any. You have to go sometimes 300 meters down. You have to go sometimes 300 meters down. You can't just...
I was working with a ministry person. We were, one of the things we had to do is get involved with the water supply.
Bottom line is...
all coming from the Kinneret. There's wells all over the country.
The bottom line is, in Israel, nobody waters from a well. Nobody.
But they take that water and they use it, people drink it.
Maybe. I've never heard of anybody putting their field because there was a well there.
No.
In Israel, everything is irrigation. And also it used to be...
There are many wells, more than you would imagine.
So again, a well, there can be many... Every place, theoretically, every place you dig, you can get to a well. The problem is how deep you have to go, and whether the ground is strong enough to hold the well, not to cave in. So in most places in Israel, you can't make a well. You can't. It's just too deep, and the ground is too soft. Once you get too low enough, it doesn't hold. So in Eretz Yisrael, it's not this way. But in the rest of the world, the civilized world, the way you decide to build a greenhouse, for instance, is because you were working in your field, and you dug, a foot by mistake, and water comes pouring out. So you use that, and you make a. It doesn't have to be a lot of water. It can be, how much water the plants need. We use drip irrigation. We don't need that much. So you have to water. You have to have a source of water. You have to have this spring from which the water comes, and that is created. How is that created? This is what we call in the soul the pleasure in godliness.
But isn't water also an indication of instability?
Maybe it fits. You could say that it fits everything, every vessel. You could say that it fits every person. The pleasure that a person, there has to be a source of pleasure in God. That has to be. What are we saying? We're saying like you have to see a person whose lips, who the sides of his mouth are dripping with honey because he's learning Torah. If you don't see that, if you never see that, the pleasure that a person receives in learning, in being close to Hashem, in davening, in leading a life that's connected to Hashem, you don't understand what the motivation is. This exists always. There's always tzaddikim that give you this sense in the world. That's the Knesset Yisrael. What they're tied into Knesset Yisrael. Knesset Yisrael is constantly watering the garden so that all manners of pleasure are grown.
It has to be a tzaddik dafka? What's wrong with
Theoretically, it would be a simple person, but usually it's not, because it has to be somebody who perceives godliness.
But Talmid Chacham also perceives God.
I said, even a person who learns Torah, it could be. But generally, it's not enough. Generally, it has to be somebody who feels in everything the sweetness of godliness. What does he want to be? I don't know what this means. And this is what we call Tanug, right, says Mark. I don't know what it means that we're adding Mark to our share. But let's see what happens. I've never tried this feature. So we'll see what happens. Okay. So you have to have, there's a source above from which the waters come down, right? What we call rainwater really is here described as what's happening in the heavens. That's the experience that there's pleasure in God, that the soul can take pleasure in God. That has to exist.
But that rainwater doesn't come down if you do something.
There he is. Okay.
If you do something about it.
Sorry?
The rain doesn't come down by itself. The rain only comes down as a result of your avoidance.
Right, so that's what he's saying. He's saying that first of all, there has to be water collected above. The water collected above is all the manners of pleasure that are collected by the congregation of Israel. It's making a lot of noise, Mark.
Sorry.
We're getting clicks from your... it's cool, though. Leave it on, leave it on.
You like it?
It sounds like
your background
he's
music.
eating your leftover dinner.
Anyway. Technology can become a pain in the pleasure place. Yeah. Where you usually sit. Anyway.
Is the Tarnug experienced by man from the same source that Hashem experiences?
I don't know what that means.
When Hashem created
We're talking
the world,
about the crown. In the crown, there's the second level of the crown is called pleasure. It's called atik. Hashem experiences pleasure. I don't know what that means exactly. In any case, Hashem has nachat ruach. Hashem has a feeling of what we call of the spirit coming down, meaning that he's dwelling in the world. That gives him nachat ruach, as we say. But pleasure, I don't know. I've never seen it.
Well, he had Tarnug before he created the world. He had pleasure from thinking about the tzaddikim that were going to be living in the world.
Type of.
Shashu, I think it was called. I don't know.
It's a little bit different than Tanu, but you're right that they're in the same place. Okay. So all of this has to be above. מוטב דלידיינה וכולו, שאפילו כל ישראל גיהנום כדאי לה. צריכה הנשמה להיות לה מירוק בגיהנום תחילה כדי שתבוא להתענג על השם באור אין סוף ברוך הוא. So the soul needs to feel this pleasure in God. That's what we call the higher waters. That's the waters above. And that has to exist in one way or another. The problem is, והנה הוא יתברך סתימה דכל סתימין, ואיך יכול לבוא לידי גילוי ההשגה. So let's say that there's pleasure. Stima de stimi means he's completely unfathomable. So you're
satum.
Satum. You can't get to it. The mind cannot wrap itself around this.
So what you're saying.
So how will
logical
this come
system
to
is
be
not real?
revealed below?
This water cycle is not a real thing.
No, the regular person who has pleasure in godliness, he's detached from the world. He's living on a mountain.
That's the gift.
Yeah. He's living on a mountain. He's on a mountaintop in a reality that's divorced from our physical reality. That's just how it is. You can't really come to this pleasure from looking at this world.
Sure you can. You got a mitzvah.
You have to extrapolate out of the world in order to receive the pleasure. So this is what I said, that whenever you get this pleasure, it's because you're sitting on Shalosh Shidduch and you're outside the world. There's nothing bothering you. You have no connection to the physical reality. And now you have tremendous pleasure in godliness. So he says, how will this come down to be experienced here below, in the mundane? It's Talmud de Satya. They're opposites.
Secret.
So he says,
Torah, learning Torah.
So this depends on an awakening from below. For it to come out, there has to be an awakening from below. Through keeping the mitzvos. By keeping Torah and mitzvos, by performing acts, you're able to bring it down. Meaning the acts are a way of skipping over what can't be revealed. And that's what we always say, that the mitzvos are the soviv. They're a revelation of the soviv. They're a revelation of the surrounding light. שהמצוות שנתלבשו בעניינים גשמיים, כמו קורבנות שהם בעל חי, תרומות מעשרות שהם בבחינת צומח, וצדקה שהיא בבחינת דומם, הנה שורשם ויסודותן מאוד נעלה בהרי קודש, ממדרגה של רצון עליון ואור אין סוף ברוך הוא. So the mitzvahs whose origin is above, when you perform them below, they bring it down to below. But again, you have to understand that when it comes out in a mitzvah, it's not going to be a direct revelation because this is not a direct thing. It's not, because you're talking about revealing something that's unrevealable. So the way that it
that's your mitzvah, go ahead, it's mitzvah. That's exactly the idea.
Perhaps because you have this continuity between them that's not coming from the mitzvahs themselves, it's coming from their origin. This is a very important thing, that the mitzvah itself, even though its origin is very high, because it's here steeped in the mundane, it might not be that at that moment you feel the pleasure from performing the mitzvah. But it's the only way to bring it down. And he says the mashal is, כנודע ממשל נפילת החומה, שמה שנפל יותר למטה הוא ממקום גבוה יותר. That when a wall falls over, the highest brick falls the farthest.
And goes deepest into the ground.
Maybe goes deepest into the ground. A lot of other things. So it affects, so the highest thing comes down to the lowest thing in reality. So the supernal becomes the most mundane. So a mitzvah becomes shechting an animal. How could that possibly be? How is that not contradictory to divine pleasure? Right? So people have this issue. We'll make a Beis HaMikdash and we'll shecht the animals again and say, I get 1,000,000 times more divine pleasure from sitting and learning a daf of Gemara than I do from shechting an animal. What are you talking about? Why would I want to do this? So the answer is, I want to do it because there's a principle here behind it, that the higher something was in terms of its sanctity, in terms of its being divorced from reality, when it comes down to the coarsest part of reality. It's just the nature, and again, this is how Hashem set things up, that it's like there's a mirror around a certain point of symmetry, a certain line of symmetry. So whatever was highest comes down to be the lowest. But because it's so low, you don't immediately sense the pleasure in it. You don't feel that. It takes time. It takes time to understand why there was pleasure in it. But the whole point of godliness was to come down. So if you don't do that, then there's no rain, as it were. And the godliness never came down, and it never rained, and it never watered the physical mundane reality. והן הם הממשיכים חיות ואור אינסוף ברוך הוא להיות בגילוי ההשגה ותענוג הנשמות בגן העליון בעולם הבריאה ובגן התחתון שבעולם העשייה. And so even though, again, the mitzvahs don't seem to be the sources of this pleasure, he says you have to accept it. That this is what creates pleasure below. The only reason that somebody anywhere has any pleasure and godliness here in our world is because of the mitzvahs that we do. That's what brings it down. Because the soul in Gan Eden, we know that it can connect, because what's unfathomable for us here is relatable there in some way. But here it's not. והדרך זה שאר כל מצוות השם שהן במחשבה ודיבור ומעשה של האדם. In the same way, all the mitzvahs that are in the three garments of the soul, thought, speech, and action. מחשבה היא כוונת המצוות. You include the thought is the kavana, the intent of the mitzvah. ודיבור הוא תלמוד תורה וקריאת שמע וברכת המזון וכיוצא בהן. And speech is certain mitzvahs that you do with your speech, like learning Torah and saying Kriyas Shema and Birkas Hamazon and so on. ומעשה המצוות המעשיות שבפועל ממש הן בחינת בריאה יצירה עשייה שבהן ועל ידן נמשך חיות ורצון ברוך הוא מהאלם אל הגילוי. And this is what builds what we call from being concealed to being revealed. And we said that that's the only way, or I'm being too repetitive. In the world of Atzilus, which is what we're building with our mitzvahs, we're building the revelation of the world of Atzilus. There we said the principle is He'elem v'Gilui, is being concealed and being revealed. God doesn't change. So the revelation is not more understood than the concealment. This is a very important point.
Wow.
When Hashem reveals himself, it's not like
you uncovered the treasure and you didn't know any more than you did before you
Exactly.
That's quite a bold statement.
Okay? Because in the world of Atzilus, in emanation, Hashem is just as unfathomable as he is anywhere else. The only difference is,
So he's down here.
it's not in the mind. The world of emanation is not the mind. Mind begins from the world of creation. There's intellect. There's understanding already. But in the world of emanation, Hashem is not understood. He's only experienced. And the experience is one of revelation, is either revelation or concealment. It's either or. It's not like our world. Our world is, we said, that's pashtus. It's pashtus. This pashtus means that he extends. It extends into the mind, into the speech, into the actions. It extends. And then it looks like a world of change. And it's like Hashem goes through change when you're in these lower worlds. And this revelation here below happens in two levels, or in two aspects: the inner light and the surrounding light. And this is very interesting. Usually he says this only about Torah. But Torah has two aspects to it: the inner aspect and the external aspect, or the surrounding aspect. But here it says, no, in every mitzvah, this is a very big change from the Tanya. Tanya, chapter 4 and 5, he explained there, again, Tanya was written 20 years before this. There he explains only that Torah is like that. The Torah has both an inner aspect and an outer aspect. The external aspect is that it's a mitzvah, so you don't have to fathom it, you don't have to understand it. The inner aspect of the Torah is different than all the other mitzvahs. You have to understand. If you don't understand what you're saying, you're not learning Torah, you're just mumbling. Okay. He says, even in other mitzvahs, this also exists. Why? Because let's take, for instance, the tzedakah. He says, in tzedakah, the way that you attain it is not because you understand it, but the way that you perform it. Right? He says, relatively speaking, even in the external, there's internal and external. This is not an important point, but it's very. I haven't seen this before that he says something like this, so I thought it was important to go over it. He says, on the one hand, it says halo paros la'ra'ev lachmecha. Tzedakah, charity, is, for instance, giving somebody something to eat.
Okay.
When you give somebody something to eat, latet mazon u'michya b'china pnimit. If you give somebody something to eat, he's integrating it right away. It becomes part of him. So that is the inner aspect of the mitzvah of tzedakah, right? In Torah, you would say, is whether you understood or didn't understand. You said the words. If you didn't understand them, you didn't digest it. You didn't integrate it. But if you understood it, so fine, that's the inner aspect of Torah, that it becomes one with you. The external aspect is you don't have to understand. So for instance, he says, there's parts of Torah that you don't have to understand. You just have to say. For instance, Chumash. If you don't understand, you still perform the mitzvah. Zohar, Chassidus even, sometimes. Just the fact that you say it, it's enough. You don't have to integrate it.
I thought it was only with Tehillim.
What? With Tehillim is because it's not. Anything that's Torah Shabachtav, you don't have to understand. So when you say Tehillim, you don't understand what Tehillim says. You just have to say it. At least say it correctly. Okay? Which is hard for a lot of people. The story from the Tzemach Tzedek's wife, that when she was older, she kept saying it with mistakes. And every time the Morash heard her, his mother, saying it, he saw that she made new mistakes. He said that's Tehillim. Tehillim, you make new mistakes on it. Just this Shabbos Mevarchim.
But someone said it told him to stop correcting it because he said that it's so powerful with mistakes.
Because I guess it's a different seru for each time.
Baruch Hanoshim. Baruch Hanoshim?
No.
A famous story of some guy who was davening at Rosh Hashanah. And his Hebrew wasn't too great. So instead of saying Baruch Hashonim, he said Baruch Hanoshim. And the Rebbe, whoever it was, said that there was supposed to have been a terrible plague against all the women. They were all going to die in childbirth. And they were saved by his accident.
Okay.
So don't rush to correct people when they make accidents.
It's pitputayo de tzadikaya. So we call the mumbling of a holy man. Okay. What do we mean? It's like in the same way that the child mumbles. It doesn't come out exactly right. So his father is very, very happy that he's talking. It takes great pleasure.
He understands exactly what he wants.
Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. Pitputayo, it doesn't necessarily mean that it makes any sense. What I was going to say is that just this Shabbos Baruch, I found a mistake that I've been saying for a long, long time. I don't remember where it is. I wonder if I'll see it again next time. I don't remember where it was. It really surprised me because it was a word that I thought it was a word that didn't make sense to me until I understood what it meant. And when I understood what I meant, I realized I was saying it wrong. Anyway, so he says the inner aspect is when you give bread, and the bread becomes integrated into the body of the person you're giving the charity to. So that's the inner aspect of the mitzvah. But there's also gam kitirei arom uchisito chinat makif. But there's also when you give them clothing, and the clothing is the external aspect. So just as in Torah,
a difference between giving him clothes and giving him food. Food stops him from dying of starvation. The clothes stops him freezing from death.
Food goes and becomes part of your body,
okay,
and the clothing is around you. It surrounds you.
True, but nevertheless, both of them are the same.
That's how you think symbolically.
That's practical mitzvah.
And he says it's the same mitzvah. But this mitzvah itself has different aspects depending on what you're doing at the moment. This is different than Torah because in Torah you're doing both with the same act. Here he's saying there's two different acts. Okay? In Torah you're learning. The very utterance of the words is already a mitzvah. And if you also understand the same words that you just said, then that's the inner aspect of it. And in some areas of Torah, if you don't have both, you didn't perform the mitzvah. The mitzvah, the one thing you did, is not complete. It's one act that has two aspects to it. Here he's saying something interesting. He's saying, again, I haven't seen this before. I'm sure he says it elsewhere, but in Tanya, he mentions that all the other mitzvot are just external. They're not internal. But here he says there's also an internal aspect to other mitzvot.
So what part of Torah do you have to understand before you see?
Shas. Shas is for sure. If you don't understand Mishnah, if you don't understand the words, if you don't understand what they mean, which is why the Gemara was written in the first place. Okay.
But the Gemara's got more layers than a dozen onions. You keep going deeper.
Not
deeper,
exactly.
deeper,
not
deeper,
exactly.
deeper.
Not exactly.
You can understand the basic.
The Gemara is.
words.
If you can't, in the end, take the whole discussion back and find it in the Mishnah, then you haven't yet completed the purpose of the Gemara. The whole reason the Mishnah was written was not because necessarily this was the best version of the Mishnah. Because what does the Gemara do? The Gemara basically pits the Mishnah against all the Braitot that we have. Meaning we had 20 different versions of this teaching. Rebbe chose one to put in the Mishnah. And the Gemara now wants to know why. Because it's missing things, it's written wrong, there are all kinds of problems with it that they knew about, that they knew what the Mishnah was trying to say. And they said it's not in the wording. The wording's in. So why did he choose this? He chose this because it reminds you of this Braita. And it pits you against this. And it'll cause you to think about this. And if you can't bring it back in the end to the Mishnah, if you finished a Mishnah in the Gemara, right? The Gemara about a Mishnah, and you don't know why everything that was discussed in the Gemara is inside the Mishnah, to a certain extent, you don't understand the Mishnah yet. Because the Mishnah is not meant to be a logical, best version of everything. It's meant to be a placeholder. It's meant to be something that refers you to the discussions. That's the way you need to think about it. It's very associative in many ways. Right? It opens up the discussion. You have to begin to think about it. So that's what the Gemara. So at one point they realized that if we don't write all this exercises down, all these discussions about the Mishnah down, we will forget them. So that's why the Gemara was written. So there you have to understand. You have to have understanding. You have to understand what they mean. All the more so in the Gemara itself. But from the Mishnah and on, you have to have understanding. Okay. So this is nothing new. We've seen this many times. That the performance of the mitzvah brings down the pleasure that is in the higher waters. Meaning, like we would say, that the Adam praying for rain brought the rain that was collected above below. In the same way, when you do a mitzvah, the pleasure that was collected by the neshama, by the soul's source above, begins to come down into the mundane world. And it's called אז תתענג על השם, על דייקה, כמו שכתוב בזוהר, והיינו שיהיה הוויה, אור אינסוף ברוך הוא נתפס ונקלט בהשגות הנשמות מבחינה פנימית, עד שתהיינה מתענגות ונהנות. And the performance of the mitzvos is what allows you then to experience the pleasure of godliness. כי המושכל הנתפס בהשגת האדם שכלו, הרי השכל וההשגה מקיפים את המושכל מכל צד, והמושכל מלובש מפנימותיו ותחתוכה, הרי שכל האדם והשגתו הם למעלה מן המושכל. And why is it called you shall have pleasure on God? So he says, because again, this is the theory, the scholastic theory of the mind, that intent means that I contain the thing I'm thinking about inside my mind. That's the picture that they had. Right? When I'm thinking of a pasuk, now that pasuk is inside my head, as it were. So if I'm deriving pleasure from it, so I'm deriving pleasure by being around the source of the pleasure. That's called al, above the pleasure.
That's united with it?
What?
That's united with it?
Yeah, in the same way that when I eat, so the food goes into my stomach, and the stomach surrounds, and by surrounding, it digests the food. It gets the nutrients out of it.
Processes. Start working.
Okay. But you have to be a makif. You have to be around it. Okay? And that's why we say that the angels stand above it. Why? Because Seraphim, they're the angels of the world of creation. And the world of creation is the world of thought. So they stand above it. What does it mean? That every time that you have a new thought, you have a deeper understanding of something, you're creating new Seraphim, creating new. That's why it's very hard to remember the new ideas. We're called Seraphim. They burn up.
So you write them down.
If you write it down, so you try to commit it already to the world of the Ofanim, of the Chayot.
That's the problem of the show.
By the way, Chayot.
That's the problem of the show. So you can't write down
Okay. Chayot, by the way, are the letters. That's the way it's usually understood. Chayot and Ofanim are the vowel signs, and the Ofanim are the letters themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's how it's understood in Kabbalah. So the Seraphim is like the thoughts, these seraphs, they're the thoughts that you have. And then when you commit it down to writing, you're bringing it down into basically, that's the chariot in the mind. And that's why Maaseh Merkavah is greater than Maaseh Bereshit. Right? There's the workings of the chariot and the workings of creation. The workings of creation is nature. The workings of the chariot is the mind. In a sense, even in science, this is one of the big questions. How is it possible that nature, if you follow an evolutionary train of mind, train of thoughts, how is it possible that nature created something that can understand itself? Right? That's the big question. How is that even possible? If I have something and it's evolving and it's slowly creating something more and more complex, okay, it'll become more and more complex. So I understand that there are animals. That I get. But how did self-reflection come about? How did that happen? How is that even possible? Because what you're saying is basically the story of Flatland. You've got people, you've got a two-dimensional world, and suddenly, from the two-dimensional world, it sprouts something that's three-dimensional, which can leap over, that can go over other objects in the two-dimensional world. I hope my example is clear, but to be able to think about nature had to go outside of itself. So that's the big question in evolution, which tears the whole theory down. Again, it tears it down as a way to explain everything. You can't explain everything with it. You can explain certain things with it. But this deviation, this coming out of your own reality to think about it, self-reflection, it can't evolve. Okay. It doesn't make any sense that it would. You have to open up a new dimension somehow. So what he's saying here is that the workings of the chariot are much greater. He's not saying it this here. I'm adding it from somewhere else, just because he mentioned so famous thoughts. He didn't explain here why he suddenly said Sofim Omdim Imalo, or why suddenly throw this verse in from Isaiah. What's the point? The point is that the workings of the chariot are considered to be much higher than the workings of nature, of creation. Because the human being can think about nature. He's outside of nature, as it were. We have to end? Okay, so we'll continue tomorrow. We're coming on, hopefully,
8 o'clock.
when we start tomorrow at 8. And hopefully we're going to get to the second chapter here, where in the second chapter, then he begins to really explain. Sorry, not the second chapter. The second part of the first chapter. He's going to explain to us how this all works with the well that they dug. Why this is connected to the well.
Time.